What's the difference between sex and intimacy?
For most people, they don't think there is a difference. In reality, there's little similar. Sex is sex. Intimacy is something entirely different, and the populace at large talks about sex as being intimate. Intimacy is that personal, private touch and exchange of feelings between two people that can happen without touch, but usually with touch. It can happen through the passage of thoughts, of recognition of what someone else is going through, your partner's going through at that time, of understanding of a need and a desire to be close physically as well as mentally and emotionally with them. And there's an exchange of such a purity of feeling at those moments, which often involves a touch, but not necessarily and usually not a sexual touch. And sexual touch in this case, from a man's perspective, means not to those erogenous zones. It's just a touch. That's all about communicating with your partner. Sex is something different. And sex, whether that be in a relationship or not in a relationship, is something very different. And sex in a relationship can take all sorts of forms by necessity, because over time it's an act that can become repetitive and boring and not fulfilling, but it's an act in those cases. When we can tie sex and intimacy together more, and if we hold it now to a relationship where we can do that more easily, is that intimacy can lead to sex. So they're not entirely separate at that point. And the lack of intimacy will cause sex to be just sex without feelings, and it will become a physical act. The lack of intimacy in a relationship can drive people apart, and they'll look for intimacy elsewhere, more than they'll look for sex elsewhere, because it's such a critical thing that's required. So intimacy and that connectivity, that sharing of energy between partners can and normally does lead itself sooner or later to acts of lovemaking and oftentimes sex. And there's a difference obviously between lovemaking and sex. Lovemaking will more naturally follow intimacy, whereas sex is more standalone. But the thing about sex in a relationship, or out of a relationship too, I suppose, is that it is a part of human nature. It's a part of connecting with people. What surprised me in my work as a medium over time has been the amount of people who I once thought to be old and now think to be not so old. So people in excess of 70 and oftentimes living in retirement villages and so forth, who had come along and seek advice from me about issues that I thought stopped with people when they were 16. Especially women, because predominantly people who see me as a medium are women. And what I learned the hard way is that the issues between men and women at 70 and 80 are no different to what they are at 16, and their outcomes and their desires are the same, and that includes sex. Their desire for sex is just the same. It might not be able to happen, but the desire is there. And what the difficulties I found were that people who were, 70s and 80s, because a man couldn't always physically have sex, the woman would say nothing, but the man's wanting something. And whilst that doesn't necessarily have to, or can end up in the act of intercourse, that's when the actions of intimacy, of all of that touch, can bring such a deep satisfaction. And with that will come a sexual arousal regardless of the age. Again, stressing that might not mean that there's the act of sex. So we bring that back into people who are younger, whether that be 30s, 40s, 50s, it's irrelevant. The desire for sex is there in men and women. It has to be, because that's how we procreate. So it's there, and it's more evident naturally in a man, but it's there. Well, it's not more evident in a man so much as a man wants or believes he wants the act of sex more often. That can cause all sorts of issues by itself, but that aside, if we have a relationship with people who are, for example, 40s or 50s, and it's sexless, and that could be for all sorts of reasons, emotional, physical, mental, whatever, can that relationship work? And that becomes a vexed question, especially if a man or the woman is fixated on this notion that sex needs to happen on this regular or semi-regular basis. And if it's not, then something's amiss. So there's such a shift as required. If we can still have all of the intimacy and there's something in it for both partners, even though it might or might not end up in the act of intercourse, regardless of age, then it can survive. But it needs, back to what Pearl said earlier, when that's the case, it needs far more acts of kindness than ordinarily would have to exist in a relationship, because so much of the failings of a relationship are covered over in what they call good sex, whatever that is. Okay, so therefore that's, for many people, a compensatory factor. Sex by itself is nowhere near as important in a relationship as intimacy, and it's that connection, it's that touch, it's that recognition at any point in time of your partner and where they're at and how to help them. So intimacy basically is getting out of yourself and into the needs of your partner and trying to fulfill those needs at a point in time. And that point in time is more and more often. So the better relationship we have, the more often we're wanting to fulfill the intimate needs of our partner, which at the same time will help us. So it's a society today where there seems to be such a concentration on sex and such a little concentration on intimacy, and that needs to shift. So relationships can survive without sex if there's a high degree of intimacy.
And particularly after menopause and andropause.
Oh my God, yes. One of the things that I notice with people in their 70s and so forth and older, men and women, they'll walk along the street holding hands, whereas they didn't in their 30s and 40s. So something changed. The danger is if it just becomes companionship. Then that can only lead to boredom. And taking each other for granted and getting in each other's hair. Therefore, there's a lack of acts of kindness and there's a lack of intimacy. If that holding hands is not a habit, if it's actually, oh my God, I love that touch of that hand in mine, I feel so much better for that, then you're going to have a different energy walking down the street together. Everything's changed. That's far more satisfying than some physical act of no feeling sex, just some release. And this can take us into so many areas, but intimacy is way more important than the act of sex. That's the bottom line.
Age makes no difference to this. And I have experience of this, which is interesting. When I was a student, I was in my 30s, I worked part-time to make some money at old people's home. When I first started that, an older nurse said to me, "You must carry a spoon in your pocket." And I said, "Whatever for?" And they said, "Because when you're showering the old men, some of them get an erection and they'll try and grope you. So you take the spoon and you hit the penis with the spoon. You go bonk, stop." I thought, what? This is a new experience. So you talk about idealism and then you find reality. Here's a very good example. You see, this would happen all the time. You know, aged care homes is a perfect example to talk about this, because the old men would grope you all the time. You'd take them to the shower and you're showering them and they would try to grab you on the breast or on the bum or wherever they would. And this was just constant, you know. And in the main, we'd all laugh at it and say, "He's just a naughty old man." But there were lots of naughty old men. And it's not just a naughty old man. You know, this is a man who's in an aged care home, whose wife has probably passed and gone. And they still want contact. They still want intimacy. They still think about sex. It's a fact. It's a reality. They still want something to make them feel that they're cared for, that they're connected, that they're whatever. Now, in the main, I had a good relationship and a laugh and a joke with these old men and just, you know, move their hand or whatever they did. But this is what they were crying out for me. Recognize me, realize that I'm a human being and I want some touch, I want some care. Now, I've known and I've watched this where, you know, an old lady comes into an aged care home, her husband's dead, an old man comes into an aged care home, his wife is dead. And they come together, they take a fancy to each other. They have the same human feelings. They want a connection. They think about sex. And I've actually known the families to say to the care homes, separate them. We can't have this, because they're wanting to hold hands or they're wanting to give each other a kiss or something like this. And I've actually known where families have said, I don't want him together with her, I don't want her together with him. Yep. Well, what's happening there is for the family. The family's saying, Dad's dead. You know, I want to keep Dad very much alive in my mind. Mum can't have a fancy for this man. This is terrible. This is disgusting. It's actually not. And if families just realised to encourage this, and if the care homes actually facilitated a little bit as well. I mean, I know they can't go romping around in each other's room and all of this. There's limits here as to what they do. But if they just encouraged it and encouraged that sharing, because, you know, that titillation, that fancy that they've got as a human being keeps them alive, gives them a bit of a verve, gives them something to get up for the next morning, go to breakfast and see this lady, you know. And how often do we see old ladies, old men who have had none of this in their lives for a long, long time, and they are simply bitter and nasty because nobody cares about them. They have no touch, they have no intimacy, they have no sharing. They have just lived an alone life cut off since a partner died or whatever. So that hunt for a mate never stops. Regardless of what anyone says, it never stops to the day you die. It doesn't matter how old you are. You like to be admired. As a woman, if someone admires you, and you're 73, you still think, oh, that's quite nice. Yeah. My husband keeps telling me that I'm getting accosted by 50-year-old men. Yeah. Good heavens.
For more spiritual knowledge, remember to subscribe. If any of the information Ian and Pearl spoke about piqued your interest, make sure you like and comment on this video below. There's so much knowledge and advice being delivered from Spirit to you via this channel. Healing your physical and emotional pains will guide you towards a more loving and meaningful life. This is the Spiritual Renaissance.